Hello, hello. How's it going? How you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you, Tyler?
Doing great. Don't mind me. I think that introduction worked, although you might have missed the beginning of the song. So
Who, me? Or our listeners
everyone
in
except
general?
for you.
Oh,
Everybody
okay.
except for you. But that's okay because we're here and we got the important thing, which is you and
Oh,
just you.
oh, stop.
Well, and your
You're,
on-air sign. The two of you together make the perfect podcast.
yes, they do indeed. It makes us official.
How have you been?
Good, good. Um, just enjoying my summer, seeing some movies, getting out, doing stuff. How about you?
Um, an attempt to be more generic than what your response was. It's been a good summer. I've done things. The family's happy and all is well. I'm still working, and yeah, summer's great.
Yeah, good. It's good
Doing
and great. Everything
try.
is good. Good.
I'm trying to keep all my hobbies active, so it's been good.
You have hobbies?
I believe it or not, podcasting is not my only ambition in life.
Uh, that would explain a lot.
It might be fair to say podcasting is not my ambition in life without only, but this is fun, so I'm excited.
Mhm.
And we
Well,
got some great.
that comes as a surprise to everyone.
Well, we have some great material today, so I don't think anyone will be surprised about that, though.
Thank you. Yes, we do have some good material. Some, I would argue, some lesser known material, or at least some things that don't get a lot of attention, um, for the most part. And but I think it's important. And if I think it's important, then it goes in the show. That's just how it goes, right?
That's how it goes. You're the boss. I'm just here
Thank
to
you.
click buttons, somewhat poorly. Click the buttons.
Oh, you're the best button clicker I know. Nobody clicks like Tyler. That's what I tell people. You want a good clicker? I know a guy. Is that sound supposed to be there?
Yes, it's me clicking buttons.
Oh, okay. Well, you're doing a great job. I didn't know it was happening, but I'm impressed.
Thank you. I've been practicing my button clicking.
Do you put that on your resume?
That's what I do for work. Is just click buttons.
Me too. Oh, this is a
We
good one.
should use these more often. I think
Yeah,
we
we
could use
should.
good podcast if we have music. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we are talking about Articles and Covenants and Hiram Page.
Yeah. The sweet sounds of With a Stone Rolling with John and Tyler.
They also
Wherever
have one
fine
called Feeding the
podcasts are
Ducks.
sold.
They also have one called Feeding the Ducks. Let's see what this is. No, I don't feed ducks to
Okay.
this kind of music.
No, I don't either.
I feed ducks to like AC/DC.
Really?
I don't feed ducks anymore. I learned that it's not good for them. But
I
in my
feed ducks to like Julie Andrews.
in my daydreams, I feed ducks to AC/DC.
Yeah, I could see this being duck feeding music.
All right. Maybe I got overboard with button clicking.
Let us know what you think of the button clicking. That's to our listeners. If you like the button clicking, let us know. Hit us up on Instagram. Send us an email. I think we have one of those.
Send us your favorite buttons to click. We can click your favorite button on demand.
Yes. Everyone loves a good button. Everyone loves clicking a good button. All right. I've have we shot the breeze enough, do you think?
Oh, I already introduced us. We're talking about Articles and Covenants and Hiram Page.
Oh, okay. I guess I'll jump into it then. Yes,
You must have missed it while I was clicking the button so professionally.
that's true. I was just blown away with the button clicking. Okay, so this one takes place right after the organization of the church. We are going to jump around a little bit, but for the most part, we're staying on our chronological path. And we're going to start with June 9th, 1830. So roughly 2 months after the church had been organized. Do you remember when the church was organized, Tyler?
April 6th.
Yeah, very good. You paid attention. April 6th, 1830. And so now we're jumping up 2 months to June 9th. And this date is significant because it was the first official conference of the church. Yeah, nowadays the church has these semi-annual conferences. This would have looked much different than that. I think it would have been attended mostly by males or priesthood holders in the church. And, you know, it's not going to be in a big lavish building or anything like that. Basically, just an opportunity for church members to come together and sort of figure out what they're doing and how they can spread the gospel. So, what happened in this conference was that a document called the Articles and Covenants of the Church of Christ was presented for a vote and acceptance to the church body. Again, this would have been just a group of male church members. These Articles and Covenants were basically, it's been called sort of the constitution of the church. And it laid out the different officers, the different positions in the church and what their duties are, in addition to how to baptize someone, the rules around baptism, and the sacrament. So very basic sort of rules and regulations, processes, and all that. Now, this document is going to be the focus of our discussion today. And to get the context of it, we have to back up exactly a year to June 1829. And at this time, if you'll remember, Oliver and Joseph are just finishing up the translation of the Book of Mormon. And they're starting to think about next steps, especially Oliver. Oliver is very anxious in figuring out how to organize the church, what the church will look like, all that kind of stuff. And he gets a revelation, which church members identify now as Doctrine and Covenants 18. And he is commanded to build a church by relying on the things that are written. So it's not so much like, you know, build a church, just go out and make stuff up as you go. He's told explicitly to rely on things that have already been written down. So what does that look like? What's been written down so far? Not much, really. Just a few Joseph Smith revelations and the Book of Mormon. Right. So he starts gathering information up, specifically from the Book of Mormon. And with this in mind, he starts to gather things that will help in the organization of the church, namely the ordinances and what the church will be doing. And he calls this collection the Articles of the Church of Christ.
And John, when you say the ordinances, at this point, obviously it's pre-temple ordinances. So what, there's baptism and receiving the gift of the Holy Ghost. Are those the only two ordinances that you're referring to, or are there others that I'm missing?
Those are the two big ones, but also the sacrament.
And the sacrament, okay.
Mm-hmm. You're right. Yeah, temple ordinances aren't even in the discussion yet. So, and that makes sense, right? That they're not really in the Book of Mormon. It's mostly just talking about baptism and the institution of the sacrament.
Yep.
So That's mostly what he's concerned with, and also ordinations and that sort of thing. So he gathers this all up. It's not a very long document. It's only one page. But one thing it does say that's important is that it talks about the prerequisites for baptism. And it says, "Now therefore, whosoever repenteth and humbleth himself before me, and desireth to be baptized in my name, shall ye baptize. And after this manner did he command me that I should baptize them. Behold, ye shall go down and stand in the water, and in my name shall ye baptize them." Now, I should point out an interesting thing about this Articles of the Church of Christ that Oliver's put together is it intertwines the instructions with his own spiritual experiences. So right here, he's talking about how he and Joseph were commanded to baptize each other and to baptize other people. So it's kind of interesting in that regard. Anyway, that's important to remember. This section is important to remember. There's a couple of prerequisites. The first is repenting and humbling yourself and desiring, right? That's basically the only three requirements for baptism. So he writes this up, and it never becomes an official church document. It's put into a book of Revelations that one of the Whitmers was gathering, but it doesn't become anything official. It's just more kept as a record. And there is some possibilities that Joseph borrowed from it, because Joseph at this time is also coming up with sort of a constitution of the church, right? And he calls his the Articles and Covenants. And it's actually very similar to Oliver's Articles of the Church of Christ, but it's much more detailed and much more fleshed out. And so it's possible that the two of them work together, and in fact, it's very likely that the two of them work together to create the ultimate or the final version, which is Articles and Covenants. And when I say final version, I don't mean the exact final version, because it went through more revisions in later years. But in this instance, we're just talking about the one that was presented to the church in June of 1830. Okay. So through the latter half of 1829, Joseph and Oliver are working on this document. And the final version is dated April of 1830. So right after the organization of the church. And again, it's more extensive than Oliver's. And the two are very similar. They both talk about priesthood offices, the different duties of church members, baptism, sacrament, etc., while it also intertwines their own experiences. Like Joseph's final version talks about his experience. It briefly touches on Moroni's visit and translating the Book of Mormon. Doesn't go into a whole lot of detail with any of that, but it's there. Talks about him repenting and trying to do what was right, and then getting a vision that he was meant to translate the Book of Mormon and all that. But it's mostly focused on how to govern the church, essentially, and what the different duties are. So we're back at June 9th, 1830. It's the first conference of the church. Joseph and Oliver present this document to the church for ratification, essentially. In the early days of the church, it was very democratic. There was at least a democratic process to it, where you would present things to the body of the church for either approval or disapproval. And so that's what they did. And everyone votes in favor of it.
So did they present? I guess I have two questions. First off, the church was organized with 6 members, right? Is it still around 6 at this time, or has it grown significantly by this first conference?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure how many people were actually at this June conference, but yeah, the church had grown pretty significantly. And when we talk about the 6 members in the April 1830 meeting were essentially people who were identified to make the church legally official, right? Like you have to have members to make it an official church that's recognized in the state. So it doesn't mean that there weren't other people who were sort of like unofficial members, right?
Okay. Question
Yeah.
2. When they presented this, did they present it as, and you may not know this, it may not even be recorded, but do you know if they presented this as a revelation or more as, hey, this is what Oliver and I came up with, or Brother Oliver and I came up with, that we think it's a good way for the church to go today?
Yeah, great question. So it is considered a revelation, but it's a different kind of revelation. If you look at the text of this revelation or this document compared to, all the other ones, most of the other ones are written in the voice of God, right? This revelation is to my servant Oliver, in whom I'm well pleased, or whatever. Whereas this one is written as the body of the church, right? We believe in this. We experience this. The first elder of the church being the one who received revelation to translate the ancient record, that sort of thing. So the language is very different, but it is considered a revelation, just kind of a different kind.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
It leads me to wonder why or how did Joseph refers to it as a revelation? Is that why you say that?
Yes, he does.
Okay.
And we'll look at that later on, actually, as the story of this document kind of unfolds a little bit.
All right. Perfect. That does make sense then. Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, the church does regard this as a revelation. And so it's presented to the church in June, and it's approved. Now, the interesting thing that happens, though, is that later on that summer, Oliver writes a very strongly worded letter to Joseph referencing the articles. And there's a section in the articles that says, whosoever humbleth himself, and this is in regards to baptism. He says, whosoever humbleth himself before God and desireth to be baptized and comes forth with a broken heart and contrite spirit. So far so good, right? It's kind of following Oliver's articles that he wrote.
Yeah.
But then it says,
heart and contrite spirits, the humility,
yep.
You have the desire, and I don't see repentance yet, but we may get there, so I'll let you continue.
Yeah. And then it says, and witnesseth unto the church that they truly repent. So there's that part. And are willing to take upon them the name of Christ. So that's a little different, but not a huge, I would argue, not a huge difference from what was already written. And then we skip ahead a little bit, and it says, and truly manifest by their works that they have received the gift of Christ unto the remission of their sins. Then they shall be received unto baptism into the church of Christ. So there's that one kind of, there's a few little differences, right? But then this one, I would argue, is kind of quite a bit different. It doesn't really touch on anything that was in Oliver's original document. You see what I mean?
That they have to manifest by their works that they have received the gift of Christ.
Exactly.
Is that a way of saying that Christ has done some act to show that they're worthy of baptism? Is that what it's saying? Or is it saying that they're actually just living the gospel in the terms that I'd use today? Which of those?
I think your latter statement is the more correct one. That people who are looking to get baptized have to show by their works that Christ has accepted them for baptism. And so if you remember, when we've talked about other religions at this time, namely Calvinism, we talked about how the chosen of God are those who, can't help but do good things. Do you remember that discussion? I did like a terrible analogy with the Death Star.
How many times do I have to tell you I don't listen to the podcast? I do remember you talking about the Death Star. You're
Yeah,
telling me
you got mad at me for that analogy. Like,
you're
whoa,
telling
that's
me
pretty disrespectful.
okay, maybe that's why we should use good analogies, because good analogies help me remember what you're actually trying to teach rather than just help me
Yeah.
remember that the Death Star was a part of this podcast. And now we have to pay Disney for our usage of the term.
No, I'm not being explicit on which Death Star. There
Oh,
could be many Death Stars.
okay.
But
Um,
okay, so I'm going to use this terrible analogy again. And I feel okay using it because it was used in grad school by one of
all
my
right.
professors.
I'll
So I
give
don't feel bad about it.
I'll give you the liberty.
Okay.
I'm loosening your leash here. Have at it.
So if you recall, episode 4, A New Hope, Han Solo and Chewie are taking Luke, Obi-Wan, R2, and C-3PO to Alderaan to deliver the secret Death Star plans. And when they get there, they come out into an asteroid field of some kind. And they see a TIE fighter, and the TIE fighter leads them to a small moon, and Han Solo tries to destroy it before it gets there. And then Obi-Wan says, "That's no moon, that's a space station." And then he says, "Turn the ship around." And Han Solo says, "Yeah, I think you're right." And so they engage their thrusters into reverse, but it's too late because they've been caught in a tractor beam. And they get sucked into the Death Star. So the analogy then is in Calvinism, the idea is that God's grace is like that tractor beam.
Now I remember. It's coming back to me.
You can't escape it. Even if you wanted to, you couldn't escape it. You couldn't help but do good things and do God's work. And then as that tractor beam pulls you closer, you're accepted into heaven, which in this case is the Death Star. Does that make sense? I mean, not really. I know it doesn't really make sense, but
yes, it makes sense. And now I have a whole new perception of grad school in the humanities world. So thank you for bringing to light
yeah, man.
two very important aspects of your education.
That's why humanities is the best.
But
It
yeah, so
just is.
basically, it's the idea that once you're saved, I don't want to say you lose agency because it doesn't go that far, but
Right.
in a very meaningful way, you are conditioned, or your way of being is naturally going to be to do what God wants you to do.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's not so much once you're saved. It's you're what's the term? Preordained, essentially. Like you can choose. Like the idea was that there were some people who chose to follow God, chose to read the Bible or go to church or whatever, but that didn't necessarily mean that you were preordained to return to heaven.
Gotcha.
So
I know
anyway,
I know we can't talk about the second anointing in Sunday school. Can we talk about it here? Is
I
that
guess
similar? Is that similar? Is that a similar sense where um, you are basically um, you're saved and you more or less can't do wrong anymore at that point? Or am I way off in left field there? Is that a similar idea, similar concept, or would you say it's different?
yeah, I think it's similar. So the caveat is I don't know a whole lot about the second anointing, but from what I
Okay.
understand, and we should give some context here. The second anointing is an ordinance in the church. From what I understand, it used to be performed a lot more frequently than it is now. But it's essentially saying that you have done everything that you need to do to get to the highest degree of heaven, and that at this point, because you've done so much and you've dedicated so much of your life, you're in, and you've shown that you're not going to deviate from the path. Now, I also know that it's been said that it's still possible to deviate, to choose to turn away from the church or whatever. But the idea with that is that if you choose to do that, the penalties are much higher, right? Because
Okay.
you've accepted much more of a responsibility.
So
So
to me, so to me, that sounds different. Then that sounds that basically you've already proven yourself, not that Christ compels you to be good. You've just
ex-
already passed the test, really.
exactly, yeah,
Okay.
you've achieved heaven through your works and your faith and the grace of God.
All
Whereas
right.
in this case, Calvinism, what we're talking about, is just you're already automatically in because you were preordained to be there. Um, so circling back to this, then Oliver Cowdery had a problem with this because it smelled too much like Calvinism to him, and it to in his mind it ran the potential, or it showed the potential of getting into priestcraft, right? Which was like, you think about priestcraft in Oliver Cowdery's mind. You do have the Calvinist idea, but you also have the idea of the Pharisees and the Sadducees of the New Testament who showed off that they had been chosen by God through, how penitent they were and how often they prayed in the streets and that sort of thing. Does that make sense?
Could you define priestcraft? When I think of priestcraft, I think of it as selling your priesthood powers. Is that where you're going with that, or is it some other meaning?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. So priestcraft, I think in Oliver Cowdery's world, would mean that, yeah, that you show your works, or that you sell your church authority for money, but also that, um, like the Pharisees and the Sadducees did, how they behaved in the New Testament, which was very hypocritical. They would do the works, right? They would go to the temple, they would teach or whatever it was they were doing. They would pray all the time. They would perform the rituals in the temple, but their heart wasn't in it. It was all in their works. And so there's that aspect, but there's also the Calvinist aspect, which is that um, your works are showing that you've been chosen, and that to Oliver Cowdery is hypocritical, um, because by showing those works, you're showing off. You're not necessarily sincere. You know what I mean?
Almost back to the law of Moses, where it's more about the works than the actual central um, Christ. It's more about doing the right works and maybe showing people that you're doing the right works rather than having your heart in the right place.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, there's some examples later on in church history of where that becomes apparent, but I don't want to give anything away. Well, have you ever heard of John C. Bennett?
Yes, I have heard of Mr. Bennett,
Yes.
Brother Bennett, Mr. Bennett, Mayor
So
Bennett.
let's make sure we're talking about the same guy. Yeah, the guy who shows up in Nauvoo and is Joseph is really impressed by him and
Yeah, he was the
makes him
mayor,
like
right?
yeah, he becomes the
And then
mayor of
he
Nauvoo.
and then he got caught up in spiritual wifery.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah, and so we'll dive into that more deeply in another episode. But that guy, I think, would have fit the bill for Oliver Cowdery. Like this, here's a guy who's going through the motions, right? He's really enthusiastic, and he's doing everything he's supposed to be doing on the surface, right, to show that he's received the gift of Christ, to borrow the language from this passage. I think that's what Oliver Cowdery was afraid of. Does that make sense? And then
Yes.
and then of course, to fill in the blanks there, John C. Bennett becomes one of the biggest apostates in the history of the church.
Yeah.
Turns against Joseph. Um, so that's what I think Oliver was afraid of. And in the letter he writes to Joseph, He says, I command you in the name of God to erase those words, that no priestcraft be amongst us. So this is pretty significant, as you can imagine. Oliver Cowdery was sustained as the second elder of the church. He's like Joseph's first counselor. He's the guy who helped translate the Book of Mormon. He's one of the three witnesses. He was one of the first to be baptized. This is a pretty significant thing. And he's calling out Joseph for some language that he doesn't approve of. Not only that, he has the Whitmers on his side. And the Whitmers, as we know, were some of Joseph's biggest supporters. So this isn't happening just in a vacuum, right? This is pretty worrying to Joseph that Oliver is pushing back on this language, especially so forcefully. And Joseph he didn't appreciate it. He writes back to Oliver and says, by what authority he took upon him to command me to alter or erase, to add or diminish to, or from a revelation or commandment from Almighty God. Sorry, I got to stifle a sneeze. Now, all of this, I should say, we don't have the original versions, the original letters that these two wrote to each other. We have Joseph's recollection from about 1835, I think, when he wrote it all down.
Could I ask a pretty obvious, or maybe give the obvious answer to that question?
Yes.
When Oliver says, I command you in the name of God, whenever I've used that term throughout my life, and whenever I've heard others use that term throughout their life, they believed that that God was speaking through them. So
Right.
if Joseph asks by what authority, isn't the obvious answer by God's authority?
Yeah. In Oliver's mind, I would think that's pretty explicit.
But from our perspective, we'd say, well, God wouldn't work in reverse order, meaning a lay member of the church wouldn't have authority to command the bishop or stake president or general authority in the name of God. So we would see that it just isn't within the order. But okay, go ahead. Sorry, I'm just thinking through it.
No, because you bring up a great point that we can touch on that we're going to jump into, which is that nowadays in the churches that exist, you're right. A typical member, like a Sunday school teacher or whoever, would not correct a stake president or a bishop, right? Because that's not, the church nowadays is very much about staying in your lane, and those lanes didn't really exist back then when the church was just a few months old. And what lanes did exist were pretty wide, in the fact that Oliver considers himself to be right there with Joseph. Yeah, Joseph was the one that found the plates and was called to translate, but Oliver was there doing the translation, writing down the translation, getting baptized with him, trying to get the book published, doing everything, going back and forth from Fayette to Palmyra, doing all of it. So and he's there when the church is organized. He helped write the Articles and Covenants. So he considers himself equal to Joseph in the eyes of in church hierarchy at this point. And so for him, he is staying in his lane. He's thinking Joseph is the one who's out of bounds here. And so you have this pretty significant disagreement, I would say. Okay. So
go ahead, John. Just one second.
Okay. So there's a lot going on at this time beyond this, which is that before August, in 1830, Joseph was living with his father-in-law. He had bought a small farm from his father-in-law on his father-in-law's property. And the idea was that with this farm, he could start, farming and supporting himself and his family. But with the church, with organizing the church, he essentially lost the support of his father-in-law, Isaac. Isaac had a brother-in-law named Nathaniel Lewis, who was a Methodist. I think he was a Methodist preacher. And this guy, Nathaniel Lewis, did not like Joseph. He wanted to run him out of town. And Joseph records that this man understood that my father-in-law and his family had promised us protection and were friendly and inquiring into the work, and knowing that if he could get him turned against me, my friends in that place would be but few. He accordingly went to visit my father-in-law and told him falsehoods concerning me of the most shameful nature, which turned the old gentleman and his family so much against us that they would no longer promise us protection nor believe our doctrines. So Isaac Hale, Emma's father, has turned against Joseph, and Joseph now has lost, one of his, not really supporters, but at least someone he could rely on for protection. He's lost that. And as a result, the Whitmers invite Joseph and Emma to come live with them in Fayette. So Joseph decides to do that, and he makes the move with the intent of, resolving this conflict with Oliver, getting his family to safety. But there was also another issue that was even more difficult to deal with, which was Hiram Page and his seer stone.
Okay, before we get there, I'm trying to put all these plots on a map here. When the church was organized, did Joseph and Emma live down in Pennsylvania? Because Isaac Hale lived in Pennsylvania. Is that where it was?
Yes.
And is that where Joseph and Emma would have lived in April of 1830?
Yes.
Okay. And then in August of 1830, that's when Isaac stopped supporting Joseph and they moved up with the Whitmers.
Correct. Yeah, and I'm drawing a blank. I think it was in Harmony is where Isaac Hale lived.
I know Harmony sounds familiar to me, and it's not critical, the city. I was just making sure I had the
yeah, they were in Harmony, and Fayette is a ways away. So they moved from Harmony to Fayette to live with the Whitmers.
Okay.
Again, because they had essentially run out of friends in Harmony.
Because of this Whitmer, because of Joseph and Oliver disagreeing with this Articles of the Church of Christ, and the Whitmers sided with Oliver, and so that's why he lost his friends down in Harmony.
Well, he lost his. That was one reason why he wanted to go to Fayette, but he lost his friends in Harmony because of Isaac Hale's father-in-law, his father-in-law Isaac Hale, and Isaac Hale's brother-in-law, whose name was I just had it. It was
Nathaniel
Newman?
Lewis. Oh,
yes, Nathaniel Lewis was a Methodist guy. He didn't like Joseph, wanted him run out of town, and he turned Isaac Hale against him, and so
okay.
So they left. They're leaving Harmony, going to Fayette, and Joseph's got this in the back of his mind. I've got to figure this out with Oliver, and also he had found out that Hiram Page had a seer stone and was receiving revelations for the church, or was claiming to. So, a little bit about Hiram Page. This guy was born in 1800 in Vermont, so very similar to Joseph. He was a brother-in-law to David Whitmer, so he was in the Whitmer family. He had married Catherine Whitmer in 1825. So he was one of the 8 witnesses, and he was baptized on April 11th, which was after the church was organized, and ordained a teacher the same day that the church had their first conference, June 9th, 1830. So obvious, he was one of Joseph's early supporters, enough so to be one of the 8 witnesses. And he was very much like Joseph and Oliver and the rest, in that he believed in folklore, magic. He grew up in that world of magic and the supernatural. He was very into supernatural healing and became a doctor. And this allowed him to travel around, and that's how well, he traveled around a lot and got to know people, which made him an effective missionary. And then there's not really a record of how or when, what the circumstances were, but he finds a seer stone, and it was described as a small flat stone that he wore on a chain around his neck.
You mentioned he was a doctor.
Mm-hmm.
In this time frame, and based on, maybe I'm being a little bit stereotypical here, with his background of folk medicine and the magic, most doctors that I would think would be into that, I would almost consider more quack-like. Did he have a medical background, or was he just a magic doctor, or maybe a quack?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not really sure. I mean, he's not like, he didn't go to Harvard Medical School. He's not. I would say he's not officially trained. He probably went through some training with like a town doctor, or maybe did an apprenticeship. But
Okay, but he probably wasn't selling the magic potion off the side of the road from town to town.
yeah, I don't think so. I don't think he was that kind, but he was the kind that, nowadays doctors are all, they have regulations, and you go to one doctor, and then you go to a second, hopefully you get the same answer, right? That's sort of the hope.
Yep.
But back then there's no regulation, right? You just find somebody who's friendly and seems to know what they're talking about, and is able to help you out. So I would definitely put him on the lower tier. He's not a surgeon like the guys who operated on Joseph's leg, or did any kind of serious medical care. But yeah, he's a traveling doctor who's very much into natural healing, and maybe even involving the supernatural.
Okay.
So yeah, so he's one of Joseph's biggest supporters, and he has this seer stone, and he had received 2 revelations concerning the organization of Zion. Now, at this point, they're kind of an interesting factoid for you. Joseph was no longer using his seer stone. He got rid of it, or put it away, or gave it to, I think he gave it to Oliver after he had finished translating the Book of Mormon. And David Whitmer did not like that. He, as we mentioned, all of these people had kind of grown up in the world of the supernatural, and David Whitmer was not an exception. One of the reasons why he supported Joseph was because of the seer stone. And after Joseph got rid of it in 1829, he kind of stopped trusting all of the revelations that came after that. In 1887, he wrote this. He said, "Now is it wisdom to put your trust in Joseph Smith and believe all his revelations and the doctrine and covenants to be of God? Everyone who does not desire to be of Paul or of Apollos or of Joseph, but desires to be of Christ, will say that it is not wisdom to put our trust in him and believe his revelations as if from God's own mouth. I will say here that I could tell you other false revelations that came through Brother Joseph as mouthpiece, that not through the stone," right? So he's saying that these false revelations did not come through his seer stone. So he was much less trusting of the revelations that didn't come through the supernatural elements, like
And remind
Urim
me,
and Thummim and seer stone.
when David Whitmer wrote this, he was always faithful, right?
David Whitmer was not.
Oh,
No,
he left the church.
he did leave the church.
Okay.
He never denied his witness or his testimony of seeing the plates and seeing the angel Moroni. But yeah, he left the church in the mid 1830s and never came back.
Okay. So did he write this after he left the church?
Yes. So this
I
was
think
written in 1887. So a
I
good
don't,
50 years after.
yeah. Okay. I don't know. I think oftentimes today people lump categories into trustworthy and non-trustworthy, and they do that based on what the status of the person is who said that. And if
Hmm.
it's the opposite of what the current person's status is, they tend to see it as less trustworthy. So I could
Right.
see how I mean, when I catch myself asking the question, so was he faithful when he said this, or was he in the church or out of the church when he said this?
Hmm.
I should challenge myself to say that, um, to take people's word for what they say rather than preemptively say that it's trustworthy or not based on whether or not they're faithfully in the church at the time they said it or not. Although I do want to also recognize the bias there too. So
Hmm.
I think it's worth analyzing, but worth analyzing my biases as I'm listening to these words.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's an excellent point. I mean, that's kind of the challenge of a historian. As you go through sources and you read what people have written or what they've said, you do have to weigh it against these other factors, like was he faithful? When did he leave? And it's like this through all of history, right? It's not just Mormon history; it's everything. Um,
Maybe I'll ask it this way to you, John. He said this after he left the church. You provided evidence at the beginning that the Whitmers were kind of on Oliver Cowdery's side of the Articles of the Church of Christ. Are there other evidences, if that's a word, other data that say that Whitmer disagreed with Joseph Smith's teachings um, post Seerstone or post 1829, other than this and the Articles of the Church of Christ?
yeah, I think one example is this one with Hiram Page, because the Whitmers did buy into what Hiram Page was saying.
Okay.
Um,
And that must be
so
why you're bringing it up here, because
mhm.
it seems to be consistent.
Yeah, yeah. So Hiram Page is getting. So let's back up a little bit. Joseph no longer has his seer stone, and Hiram Page does have his seer stone. Hiram Page is receiving revelations. Joseph is receiving revelations. Um, David Whitmer. I can't speak for the other Whitmers specifically, but David Whitmer is going to side with the one with the seer stone because that's where his testimony came from originally. Uh, that's sort of the building blocks of his faith and his belief in the church.
Again,
And,
at this point, I don't think anyone had a testimony because Joseph Smith had the first vision. I
right.
kind of go back to they had the testimony because they believed the Book of Mormon was translated from gold plates, and Joseph Smith was chosen of God to do that translation and chosen um, to
Yeah.
be. Would they have the perception that he's chosen to be the president of the church, or mostly just chosen to be the person who translated the gold plates, or would that just depend on the
Yeah.
individual?
Yeah. That's a great question. I think those things are still being developed. The perception, for sure, they believe that Joseph had a supernatural gift that came from God to translate the Book of Mormon, and that he had been. I don't know that they would say he specifically was chosen to organize the church, but I think it's more likely that they considered all of them to be chosen to establish the church, like Oliver Cowdery. As I said, this he believed himself to be right up there with Joseph, and um, and the Whitmers, I think too. They've had these experiences. Granted, those experiences came through Joseph, but those experiences, I think, did in their mind put them on his level. This is more of a team effort now, right? That's why you see things need to be presented to the church for approval, and there's conferences to talk about how the church should proceed and what kind of responsibilities everyone has and how they can spread the message and all that sort of stuff. It's a team approach to doing God's work. And Joseph's story was easy for them to believe because of the supernatural element that it had. Like David Whitmer, for example, was much more inclined to believe Joseph because of all the things that we've talked about in previous episodes. There was a magical element to it, and that's the world that they lived in. It's nowadays we talk about Joseph being the call to restore the gospel, and I don't think that idea, that concept had quite formulated yet. It wasn't concrete yet, and I don't think it was really concrete for many decades after the church was organized.
In through Brigham Young's leadership, then to be decades, right?
Yeah. I think it starts. Brigham Young was definitely very loyal to Joseph Smith, and I do think that he was very forceful in pushing it, or at least developing that concept. But I don't think it really took place until the end of polygamy with Joseph F. Smith in the early 1900s. The church gives up polygamy, which was a major part of the church's identity. And now Joseph F. Smith has to figure out a new way to define the church. You know what I mean? It's not like they just gave up a major piece of their doctrine. And so what are we going to base our history on now? What are we going to move forward with? And Joseph F. Smith says, well, we're going to move forward with the idea of the restoration, and that Joseph Smith was called of God to restore the gospel, and he's the first prophet of the latter days, and all that kind of stuff.
And Joseph F. Smith is Hiram Smith's grandson? Is that?
He's Hiram Smith's son. Yeah, so
Hiram
he was
son. Okay.
Yeah, he was the president of the church in the early 1900s up until about World War I.
Okay, cool.
But yeah, so I think again the way we perceive this time in the church is that, or at least the way that the church nowadays defines this early part of the church, is that Joseph Smith was called of God to do these things, whereas back then I think it's that idea is not fully conceptualized yet. It's more like, oh, we're all a part of this great work. Joseph got it started, yeah, but we're all part of it. We're all in it together, and we all kind of have a say in how it goes. Now, this is where the articles and covenants become important, I would say, because this is probably the first step in redefining the structure of the church and that identity that we've been talking about, that Joseph F. Smith finally puts into a concrete form. So this is where we're at now, right? To kind of reset the stage, we have Joseph Smith. He's moved back to Fayette. He's living with the Whitmers, who Oliver Cowdery is there. He's very good friends with the Whitmers. So Cowdery and the Whitmers have a problem with a piece of doctrine that Joseph put in the Articles and Covenants regarding using works as a manifestation of your receiving the Holy Ghost, or the divine approval. And Hiram Page, who's a part of the Whitmer family, has a seer stone, and he's receiving revelations. So this is what Joseph's dealing with now, and he's trying to figure out what he's going to do. And you can see why Hiram Page receiving revelations would be a problem for Joseph. It may not have been a problem for other members of the church, right? Because as I said, they all kind of view themselves as in this work. They're all in it together. So why not have Hiram Page receive revelation? But for Joseph, if everyone is just pumping out revelations willy-nilly, then there's chaos, right? There's no cohesive vision. Now, you could also take a pessimistic view of this towards Joseph and say, well, he didn't want to give up power, right? You got to put that in play as well. Either way, Joseph sees this as a crisis.
Yeah,
And the other,
I think everyone's dealt with that dilemma of uh, personal revelation, and can it go contrary to church doctrine or can it not?
right.
I think that's something that every one of our listeners has contemplated and hopefully has come to some sort of resolution within themselves about. So I don't
Yeah.
I don't know if I have an answer for everyone on that, but I
Mhm.
understand where you're going with it.
Right. Yeah. So this is, I think, just like you said, this is why I think this period and this document, the Articles of Covenants, are very important in the history of the church. So he's dealing with all of this, and he decides two things. The first is he's going to just have a talk with the Whitmers and with Oliver regarding church doctrine. And he says in his history that essentially he sits down with each of them and they chat, and they decide it, and he's gradually able to win them over by saying, "Look, um, the revelations state that I'm the one that's got the authority to receive revelation. I'm the first elder, um, and and all this stuff. I'm the one that, you know, God has chosen, whatever language he uses." And gradually he wins them over one by one, and so that crisis is somewhat averted. The the other one, though, the Hiram Page and his Seer stone, are much more difficult for him to overcome. And the church is scheduled to have another conference on September 26th, 1830. And he decides that he's going to resolve it then. And in the meantime, he's thinking about it a lot. He says, as a conference meeting had been appointed for the first day in September, that's a typo that he put in. He wasn't remembering that correctly. I thought it wisdom not to do much more than to converse with the brethren on the subject until the conference should meet. And Joseph, again, he's thinking about it, and he's praying for guidance. And ultimately, he gets Doctrine and Covenants 28, which is a revelation meant for Oliver. And it says, "And again, thou shalt take thy brother Hiram Page between him and thee alone, and tell him that those things which he hath written from that stone are not of me, and that Satan deceiveth him. For behold, these things have not been appointed unto him, neither shall anything be appointed unto any of this church, contrary to the church covenants." So right there's a reference to the Articles and Covenants. Not explicitly, but that's what it's talking about. That's what Joseph meant there. And then he says, "For all things must be done in order and by common consent in the church by the prayer of faith." Um, and then again, "And thou shalt assist to settle all these things according to the covenants of the church." So Joseph is starting to get a vision here that, like, we have these articles and covenants. This is what the church government is based on, and this is what the order of the church is based on. And the night before the conference, Newell Knight was with Joseph, and he said Joseph was just a wreck. He was up praying the whole night. And but in this conference, Joseph decides to put the articles and covenants to the test, and he has Oliver read through them. And as Oliver's reading through, Joseph kind of takes time to explain what they mean. And there's one section in there that says, "All things shall be done in order and by common consent in the church by the prayer of faith." So this is what the revelation to Oliver was repeating, right? All things shall be done in order and by common consent in the church by the prayer of faith. So ultimately, Joseph presents the question to the church. And again, this is much like the conference in June, which was, just a bunch of male members of the church meeting together. And he presents the question: do others besides Joseph have the authority to receive revelation for the church? And they talk about it, they discuss it, they put it within the context of the Articles and Covenants. And ultimately, the church body votes that Joseph was the only one to have the authority to receive and write revelations and commandments for the church. So you can see why this is sort of a momentous occasion in church history, because it sets a pattern for the rest of the history of the church, which is there's one prophet, there's one president, and he's at the head. He's the only one with the authority to speak for God, right? And the church has been dealing with this ever since, like for good and bad, And so does that make sense? Any comments, questions on any of that?
No, I think it makes clear sense. This is why you start off with this being important. This is when Joseph Smith becomes the authoritative head of the church.
Yeah. I think it's a major step in that direction, but also it's a major step in the church trusting in processes and sort of an order that has already been established, right?
Okay.
Because you look at the Articles and Covenants, and it does talk about Joseph as, having these experiences, but for the most part, it's just laying out these rules and ordinances and processes by which things should get done. And so it is taking a step in the direction of giving Joseph more authority, but it's also taking a step in saying that this is a legitimate church that's not based on one person's charisma. And we talked about, the Second Great Awakening a lot, and how many of the movements were based on these individuals who were just very charismatic and powerful speakers and, did all these wonderful things in the eyes of the people who were following them. In this case, yes, again, Joseph he's giving more authority to himself as the president or prophet, however it was defined then. But he's also systematizing things. Like, this is how things are done. It's not the direction of the church is not based on the, sudden, or it doesn't go in these different directions based on someone's, how people are feeling that day. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Okay, cool.
So yeah, I think in that sense, it's important and a significant moment in church history. So just to summarize, through the Articles and Covenants, Joseph was able to sort of resolve these two very troublesome events in his life. First, he was able to resolve the question of doctrine, and he was also able to resolve the question of authority. And that the church has seldom deviated from that since then.
Awesome. Well, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope our listeners enjoyed it.
I did. I keep reminding myself that this is not from a Sunday school perspective, rather more a scholarly perspective. And I noticed you kept saying things like, from the perspective of how Joseph Smith would have perceived certain things, rather than God or anything like that. But I'm taking that that's very much how you would look at it in an academic setting. So
yeah, definitely. For the purposes of this podcast, I think that's definitely what we try to do.
Yeah. So I do appreciate it being presented that way, but I just wanted to recognize that for those who wonder, if you wonder, why is it that Joseph Smith might see that threatening rather than it's actually God just doing the things. It's just the perspective that the approach we're trying to take is from the academic or maybe scholarly perspective, which only has words of Joseph Smith. We don't have any direct, based on the scholarly articles, the authorship has not been credited to deity today.
Yes.
So.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Correct.
Cool. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Great job.
Yeah.
Do we know what's next, or is it just a big surprise?
Well, usually when I give a teaser, we end up going in a different direction, but
it'll be a great surprise. Oh, but
I'll say I'm not sure what the next episode will be about. But what we do have coming up is we got to talk about the first vision. Up to this point, we've kind of, skimmed over it. We've acknowledged it, but we haven't dived into it. And that's because, again, the goal of this podcast is to take a chronological view of the church by sources, not by narrative. And so when we get into the early 1830s, that's when Joseph first starts to publicize his spiritual experience that is now known as the first vision.
Cool. Well,
so I think that'll be the next episode. Yeah, I think that'll be the next episode, but I don't want to promise anything because usually we go in a different direction.
Awesome. Well,
we're also going to start to have more guests on, so look for that.
I've heard some big names coming through, so I'm excited. I'm excited to get those out and get the opportunity to talk with them. You've done a lot of great work along that front, so I'm super excited.
Yeah, that'll be fun.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thanks, John. We'll have a good one. Life's rough. Roll on.